Today's lecture will be on Chapter 13, Post-War Social Change, Section 3, Cultural Conflicts. Today we're going to look at what were the effects of prohibition on American society, what issues of religion were at the core of the Scopes trial, and how did racial tensions change after World War I. So starting us off today, we want to take a look at prohibition of alcohol, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Prohibition was seen as progressive reform. Progressivism, if you recall, as discussed previously, was an attempt to solve the social ills of society, especially in this new urban industrial world. And many would have concluded that one of the major problems was alcohol consumption. So the stated goals of prohibitionists were to one, eliminate drunkenness and the resulting abuse of family and family members or others. So you can have like domestic violence or the like. They also wanted to get rid of saloons or bars or pubs where they felt were hotbeds of prostitution, gambling, and other vices. The third goal was basically to prevent the economic turmoil instituted by alcohol, absenteeism, on the job accidents that stemmed from those that were drinking. So the 18th Amendment to the Constitution ratified in 1919. The Volstead Act was passed and therefore gave Congress the power to regulate said alcohol. But almost immediately, we are going to see that vast numbers of people are ignoring the law. And who's ignoring the law is going to further exacerbate these differences between rural and urban America that we discussed earlier. Where rural American, a 1924 report showed that Kansans obeyed the law about 95% of the time. Where New Yorkers, those numbers were completely reversed. About 95% were disobeying the law. So again, we see this contrast between urban and rural voters, or urban and rural citizens, rather. And so we're going to see the rise of these two terms here. So we're going to see the bootlegger, right? So a bootlegger is basically someone that's just going to be in the process of selling these illegal goods, in this case, alcohol. The term bootlegger actually comes from the Civil War, where on military bases where alcohol was banned, alcohol would be smuggled in the boots of other soldiers. They'd put a bottle like in their military boot, and then they could carry it around on base. So the bootleggers are going to be supplying the alcohol to these speakeasies. And a speakeasy is just an illegal bar or restaurant that would sell the alcohol. The alcohol itself could be made made by a local supplier in like an illegal still or something like that. And a still, of course, is just a device where you turn corn, grain, potatoes, or other fruits and vegetables into alcohol. So it could be made within the United States. Very often it was smuggled in from Canada or the Caribbean. And so, what we're going to find here is that an interesting facet comes around where the number of drinking establishments actually increases during Prohibition. So, for example, Washington, D.C., prior to Prohibition, there were 300 licensed saloons, where one estimate during Prohibition, there were more than 700 speakeasies. Massachusetts, before Prohibition, had about 1,000 saloons, where Boston alone would have 4,000 speakeasies during the Prohibition. So clearly, we're going to see that the vast number of people are just not following the law. And as stated previously, this tended to follow this urban rural divide that we've talked so much about. Of course, one of the unintended consequences of prohibition was, again, this increase in alcohol consumption. But then it would be who would be supplying the alcohol consumption, or the alcohol for consumption. And so what we see is that we're going to see the rise of organized crime. There was just so much money to be made by selling this illegal alcohol that gangsters originally, working independently, are going to decide that if they can work together, they can make more money, they can handle more alcohol, and they can sell to wider areas. Of course, once I'm selling illegal alcohol, it may not be that difficult for me to shift over into doing other illegal activities: gambling, prostitution, racketeering. So if you don't understand what racketeering is, basically, if you want to think about it, you may force a local business to pay you a certain fee for quote unquote protection. If they did not pay the fee, then you yourself would damage their particular businesses, or maybe injure them themselves. So that is part of this racketeering, and we're going to see gang wars erupting as these different gangs are vying for control for this very lucrative uh, business. Al Capone, probably the most notorious gangster of this particular period, based out of Chicago. Al Capone, nicknamed Scarface, would become to dominate the alcohol industry. Estimates showed he was making $60 million a year in 1920s money, and so he could easily buy the cooperation of police, city officials, politicians, judges, even juries. Um, Capone would finally be arrested, not for violating the Volstead Act and selling alcohol, not for the murder of other individuals, not for promoting gambling and prostitution. But no, he's going to be finally charged and convicted of income tax evasion. They could prove that he was making an awful lot of money and he was not paying taxes on that. So alcohol again becomes the big division, or at least one of the big dividing issues of the 1920s. Another issue we want to take a moment to look at is the issue of religion and the rise of fundamentalism. So, first of all, remember the 20s and the progressive era before that is an era of science, is an era of, the best and the brightest, so to speak, and they are going to be try to solve particular problems. And there's a lot of things that had been going on in the last couple of decades that had led some to question their faith. So whether it was just science and technology taking a larger role in everyday life, whether it was some biblical scholars that had begun to look at the Bible and point out specific contradictions or historical inaccuracies, or whether it was just the World War I itself and the influenza epidemic and the Spanish flu thereafter, that really led many people to maybe question whether God took an active role in human affairs, or whether God even existed at all. So there was the rise to challenge this particular movement was called fundamentalism. And in a nutshell, fundamentalists would argue that the Bible was inspired by God and therefore could not contain contradictions or errors. As a matter of fact, the Bible is literally true. Right? Every story in the Bible actually took place as described. So for Noah and the flood, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, not 39 days, not 41 days. It is in the Bible, and so therefore it is true. And we're going to see then a rise of a number of these fundamentalist preachers traveling the country, taking advantage of some of the technologies we were talking around. Probably the most famous was former baseball player Billy Sunday, who gave sermons on the evil of alcohol. And had these revival meetings that as he traveled the country, it was estimated that 100 million people came to visit his revival meetings. So extremely popular. The issue of religion is probably going to come to a head, or at least the pinnacle of this movement at the period is going to be the Scopes trial. So the Scopes trial is going to focus national attention on a Tennessee law that forbade the teaching of evolution in school. Of course, the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin's theory that's in a nutshell, species evolve over time, and humans are certainly part of that scientific processes. And what we're going to see is a lot of states in the nation uh, passed laws to ban this practice in public schools. Most schools are local affairs, and if you're a parent and you believe a certain thing, and you're going to raise your family and your kids to believe a certain thing, and then the schools are going to challenge that, you may have a problem with that, and you may go to your elected officials to get that change, which is what many states did, including the Tennessee. Uh, so, high school teacher John T. Scopes taught evolution in class and was arrested for it, and was taken to trial. And this trial became what was called the trial of the century. We will have several trials of the century during the 20th century. But it really went into the idea of, personal freedom versus religious freedom, and whether the teaching of evolution contradicted the Bible, and to a larger extent. Again, we have this challenge between this much more sort of modern scientific America, or an urban America, versus a rural, more traditional, more religious America. The Scopes trial would be the first trial to be broadcast over the radio. So in 1925, people could hear the trial itself, or at least the daily transcripts of what had happened here. The trial is going to be known for its two lead lawyers. So defending Scopes is going to be Clarence Darrow, a strong supporter of free speech. He was a very famous lawyer at the time for defending political or labor activists, for example, like Eugene Debs. The lawyer for the prosecution is going to be none other than William Jennings Bryan, a man who ran for president 3 times, an outspoken fundamentalist, and he had taken up the side of the prosecution. So, in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee, in July 1925, these two icons of American society, along with all the new mass media, the journalists, are going to center, and we are going to pay, or the nation at least is going to pay a lot of attention during this 10-day trial. To be fair, there wasn't much to the trial. The law said that you can't teach evolution. Scopes admitted that he taught evolution. He would be found guilty. However, because there's much more to this than just whether or not he was guilty or not, and had to pay the $100 fine, the issue became about religion, and sort of the dramatic climax, I guess, of the case is when Bryan himself took the stand to testify as an expert on the Bible. And under some pretty brutal kind of cross-examination, Darrow got Bryan to admit that he did not literally believe that every aspect of the Bible was 100% true. And so this was this kind of dramatic kind of win for for the urban kind of scientific world. Fundamentalists are going to see Bryan as a martyr for the cause, because he died just a few days after the trial. So again, we're going to see these racial, or sorry, these religious tensions going on between urban and rural America, and that will shift us to the last issue we want to look at today, which are these racial problems that are going to be going on in America. So to if you do recall, we've talked quite a bit about something called the Great Migration. So from about 1890 to about 1940, large numbers of African Americans are going to be moving from the South to the North. And in the summer of 1919, this is going to come to a head, and there's going to be a number of race riots around the country. Pay attention to 1919. This was called Red Summer, largely because of the blood that was spilled during these riots. But 1919 is going to be a pretty tumultuous year for several reasons. And in the next couple of lectures, as I discuss that, I will hearken back to this point here as well. But let's focus on the race riots here. So, happening 25 cities throughout the country, Omaha, Tulsa, Washington, D.C. Probably the worst of all of these happened in Chicago. So if you see the picture in the center of the line here, this is the beach of Chicago, and you can actually see a rope running down the center of the picture here, starting in the lower left-hand corner and then moving diagonal down the beach. This was the color line, and you can see it depicted in the cartoon below. There was the color line on the beach. The beaches were segregated. The lake was segregated. Um, Seems a little strange, but this is what was the idea here. So obviously, summer 1919, very warm, no air conditioning. A lot of people were out on the lake. Well, what happened was a group of young men fashioned themselves a raft, and they floated out into the lake, not very far, 30, 40, 50 yards out into the lake. And they were jumping off the raft, doing backflips, and just swimming around, having a good time. If you've ever been to the beach, especially the beaches of Lake Michigan, you know that the waves will tend to push you down the beach one direction or the other. And so these young men on the raft were drifted into the white side of the beach and the white side of the water, and basically some yelling ensued. The young men either didn't really understand what was going on or were trying to make a game of it. Some people started throwing rocks at the young men, and they were dodging the rocks, etc., until one of the rocks hit a 17-year-old young man. He was knocked unconscious, fell in the water. His friends went in to get him. They dragged him out and dragged him on shore. And of course, they dragged him to the white side of the beach, which then a struggle ensued. The young man did die of the injury, whether it was the hit in the head or the fact that, or he drowned after being knocked unconscious. I guess it doesn't really matter in that sense. He was killed. A fight ensued between the whites and some African Americans that had come over to that side of the beach. The police came and, of course, arrested the African Americans, not the young men who had thrown the rocks. And anyway, so this was the touchstone that kicked off these riots that really lasted several days within the city and in many parts. In the end, some 23 African Americans were killed, 15 white people were killed, 537 people were wounded, and just an amazing amount of destruction was caused by this. So when we talked about the Great Migration, we said African Americans were leaving the South for the North for economics, but also to avoid racial animosity. And certainly, this animosity was much less in the North, as we have seen here. It was certainly non-existent. or it was certainly not non-existent. Excuse me. Another aspect we're going to see of racism in the North in the 1920s is the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan had basically been wiped out right after the Civil War. President Grant's campaign against the Ku Klux Klan had been pretty effective. However, in the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan is going to come back, largely inspired by a film called The Birth of a Nation, which portrayed the Klan as these valiant, freedom loving Americans, tying them to the founding fathers, and the ultimate sign of patriotism. And it portrayed African Americans as shiftless, lazy, demonizing them, and portraying them as maniacal in other ways. So this film then would actually lead to the rebirth of the Klan in the late teens, early 1920s. And by 1922, the Klan membership had grown to about 100,000. Just 2 years later, in 1924, it was up to 4 million. And so you can see in the graph in the lower right there, the numbers skyrocketing during this period. The focus of the Klan had shifted a little bit. So obviously, they're still going to be targeting African Americans, but they're also targeting any group that they saw as un-American. And so if you can think of the 1890s through the early 20th century, this massive influx of immigrants, these immigrants would become targets of the Klan, as well as African Americans. The Klan would be going after Catholics, Jews, other immigrants, any other group that they saw as sort of un-American. This not what they saw as American were purely the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Klan will diminish after 1925 as the leader of the Klan, William Simmons, in Indiana, was arrested and sentenced to life in prison for assaulting a young girl. The nation was shocked by this, and of course, we see the decreasing of the Klan. But certainly, the Klan is still an organization within the United States today. Certainly not as influenced as this, where we see in the map in the upper right hand corner all the little dots on the map are locations of Klan activity between 1921 and 1925. And here in 1924, we see the Ku Klux Klan marching on Washington. Again, probably the height of their power within the United States. But fighting this racial animosity or this increase of action against African Americans, we want to look at two different groups. So again, we're going to talk about the NAACP that was continuing to fight the good fight. So they fought to propose anti-lynching laws, federal anti-lynching laws. It did pass the House, but failed in the Senate. They tried to put forth a lot of actions to increase African American voting rights. Both of these would have limited success, although we do see the number of lynchings decreasing during this period. The NAACP is going to be fighting the long fight on this. And so they're, at least in the 20s, like I mentioned before, somewhat limited in success. Another movement we want to talk about is led by a guy by the name of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is sort of the next African American civil rights leader we want to look at. Continuing maybe in the ideas of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, we see Marcus Garvey, a native of Jamaica, had come to the United States, and really felt that he could help this particular movement. And for quite some time, he was very popular within the African American community. And his plan for success for African Americans was basically twofold. First of all, he really felt that African Americans really really had to leave the United States. The United States was not going to be a place where they could be successful. And he argued that they should return back to the motherland, return back to Africa. He'd actually gathered about $10 million, bought a steamship company, and was going to use this to get African Americans out of the United States and back to a place where they could be treated as equals. Obviously, this part of his movement was unsuccessful, but the part of his movement that did really make a big difference was his argument that African Americans needed to have some self respect, some racial pride, some independence. He argued that. African Americans shouldn't try to adopt white middle class standards. They're a proud people of a proud history, and they need to be proud of that. Don't be ashamed of being black. Be proud of it. And this is probably the part of the movement that really caught the most on. Now, again, to be fair, most immigrants coming to the United States during this time were abandoning the culture of the old country, so to speak, and learning English and trying to become as quote unquote American as possible. Garvey's idea of racial pride and racial self-respect will be one that does stick, that does stay, and will be adopted by several other ethnicities. And when we think about America in the 21st century, we often do quite a bit to celebrate our ethnic diversity. If you can go to any major city in America, we will have ethnic festivals throughout the year celebrating cultures, dress, music, food, and the history of particular peoples that are now part of the United States. Garvey's movement would run into some problems. The company was mismanaged, and there was some corruption within the shipping line itself. Garvey himself was jailed in 1925 on some mail fraud charges relating to the sale of stock for the company. His sentence was later commuted, and he was deported back to Jamaica. But like I said, the Black Pride movement within the African American community and other communities would survive him. So again, today we looked at the effects of prohibition on American society. We looked at issues of religion that were at the core of the Scopes trial, and we discussed how racial tensions changed after World War I.